We've all seen the headlines and news stories. The pandemic has drastically increased the prevalence of remote work. Now, more than ever, individuals are no longer tethered to bustling city centers for their jobs. They have the freedom to live in quieter, less populated areas, swapping out blaring sirens and crowded sidewalks for the serenity of more rural settings. This trend got us thinking, what are the least populated states in the US and why is that so? So let's uncover why that is. What factors contribute to these states' low population densities? Intrigued? Well, buckle in as we dive into the whys and hows of these sparsely populated states. Starting off with Maine, famously known as the Pine Tree State. This state, renowned for its rugged beauty and pristine wilderness, is the least densely populated state in New England. Why is this so? Well, the answer lies in its geography and climate. Maine's landscape, dominated by rolling hills, dense forests, and jagged coastlines, is a sight to behold, but not the easiest to live in. The terrain can be quite challenging, making it difficult for large-scale urban development. Moreover, Maine's climate is another significant factor. The cold, harsh winters can be quite daunting, deterring many from settling down here. Additionally, unlike other states, Maine lacks major metropolitan cities. While Portland and Bangor are bustling hubs, they're not quite on the scale of a New York or a Chicago, which can limit job opportunities. So, Maine's beautiful wilderness is more of a home to moose than to people. Next on the list is Montana, the Big Sky Country. Now, wouldn't you assume that a state with such a grand nickname would be teeming with people, eager to live under the vast skies? Yet, Montana's population remains one of the lowest in the United States. This sparsity is largely due to its expansive rural landscape. The state's wide-open fields and towering mountain ranges, while beautiful, make it a challenging place to establish densely populated communities. The severe winters here don't help either. Imagine braving sub-zero temperatures and heavy snowfall for half the year. It's enough to give even the most adventurous among us second thoughts. Another significant factor is the limited job opportunities. Montana's economy is primarily based on agriculture, mining, and lumber, sectors that don't exactly attract a massive influx of job seekers. So, that's the story of Montana, where the sky is indeed larger than the population. Moving to the smallest state in the Union, Rhode Island. Though diminutive in size, this state, affectionately known as the Ocean State, packs a punch when it comes to character. Rhode Island's size, however, does play a significant part in its relatively low population density. Covering just over 1,000 square miles, it doesn't offer much in the way of rural or undeveloped land for population expansion. Its coastal charm and rich history draw many to its shores, but the limited space does mean that population growth is inherently constrained. The state's compact size also means that there aren't large areas of uninhabited land, as you might find in other states, contributing to its lower overall population density. But don't let the small size fool you. Rhode Island is full of vibrant culture, stunning coastline, and a close-knit community that many of its residents wouldn't trade for all the land in the world. Small but mighty, that's Rhode Island for you. Now, let's talk about Delaware, the first state. Despite its historical significance as the first state to ratify the Constitution, Delaware is often overshadowed by its larger neighbors, contributing to its low population density. It is the second smallest state in the United States, which limits its capacity to house a large population. Moreover, the absence of major urban centers in Delaware also plays a role in its population count. Wilmington, the largest city, is home to just over 70,000 residents. The rest of the state is largely composed of small towns and rural areas, which offer a slower, quieter pace of life. The state's economy, primarily centered around agriculture, manufacturing, and service industries, might not provide as many job opportunities as larger, more urbanized states. However, these very characteristics contribute to Delaware's charm, making it a haven for those seeking a peaceful, laid-back lifestyle. Delaware, a small state with a big historical significance. Heading west, we reach South Dakota, home of Mount Rushmore. This state, known for its majestic landscapes and iconic landmarks, is far more than just a tourist destination. In fact, South Dakota's low population density is a tale of rural living, harsh weather, and limited economic opportunities. Most of South Dakota is rural, with vast expanses of farmland, fields, and wild prairies. This rural nature can make living in South Dakota a challenge, with limited access to amenities and services that are readily available in more populated areas. Now let's talk about the weather. South Dakota is known for its brutal winters, with temperatures often dropping below zero. This harsh climate can deter many from making South Dakota their home. Lastly, the lack of diverse economic opportunities also contributes to the low population density. While agriculture and tourism thrive, other industries are sparse, limiting job opportunities for residents. South Dakota, where you might find more bison than people. Moving northwards to North Dakota, the Peace Garden State. This state, known for its tranquil beauty and vast landscapes, is home to a surprisingly low number of residents. But why is this the case? North Dakota's population density is one of the lowest in the United States. A key factor contributing to this is the state's harsh climate. With biting winters and scorching summers, it's not the most inviting place for those accustomed to milder weather. Moreover, North Dakota is predominantly rural. With fewer urban areas and major cities, it lacks the bustling activity and job opportunities that attract people to more populated states. The state's economy, heavily reliant on agriculture and energy extraction, offers limited job diversity, which can be a deterrent for those seeking a broader range of employment opportunities. Despite these factors, North Dakota's residents find charm in the state's peaceful, quiet lifestyle. It's a place where the pace is slower and the skies are boundless. North Dakota, where peace and quiet are a way of life. Let's journey to Alaska, the last frontier. Encompassing over 600,000 square miles, Alaska is the largest state in the U.S., but it's also one of the least populated. The reasons are many, but let's delve into a few key factors. First, the weather. With temperatures plunging to -60 degrees Fahrenheit in winter, it's not a climate for the faint-hearted. This extreme weather makes everyday activities a challenge and deters many from making it their home. Next, we have geographical isolation. Alaska is detached from the contiguous United States, creating a sense of seclusion. This distance from the rest of the country also leads to a lack of infrastructure. There are fewer roads, fewer cities, and fewer services available. These factors, combined with a rugged landscape and an economy primarily based on natural resources, contribute to its low population density. Alaska, where the wilderness still reigns supreme. Next, we visit Vermont, the Green Mountain State. The name itself paints a picture of verdant, rolling hills, and those aren't just for show. Vermont's landscape is dominated by the Green Mountains, a challenging terrain that isn't exactly conducive to large-scale settlement or agriculture. This mountainous topography is a major factor contributing to the state's low population density. Then, there's the matter of Vermont's winters. They're beautiful, sure, but they're also long and harsh. The frigid temperatures and heavy snowfall can be daunting for many, making it a less attractive place for year-round living. Lastly, let's talk about job opportunities. Vermont is known for its dairy farming and maple syrup production, but these industries don't create a wide array of job opportunities. The state's economy is primarily rural, with limited options for employment in diverse fields. Yet, for those who value tranquility, nature, and a slower pace of life, Vermont's sparse population could be seen as an advantage. Vermont, where the maple syrup flows freely and the populace is sparse. Finally, we reach Wyoming, the cowboy state. A land of rugged mountains, open plains, and a sky that stretches on forever, Wyoming embodies the spirit of the American West. However, Wyoming's population is as sparse as its wide-open spaces. This is largely due to its expansive rural landscape, which, while stunning, can be isolating. Towns are few and far between, and the state lacks the bustling metropolises that attract large population numbers. The harsh climate is another factor keeping the population low. With long, cold winters and short, hot summers, Wyoming isn't for the faint of heart. Finally, economic opportunities here are relatively limited, with the economy primarily based on mining and agriculture. While these industries provide jobs, they aren't enough to attract large numbers of people. Despite these challenges, Wyoming's residents embrace their lifestyle, cherishing the peace, quiet, and natural beauty that their state offers. Wyoming, where the deer and the antelope play and the human population stays minimal. So, there you have it, the 9 least populated states in the U.S. and the reasons why. We've journeyed from the pine tree state of Maine to the cowboy state of Wyoming, exploring the unique characteristics and challenges that make these states less populated, but certainly not less captivating. Whether it's the harsh climate of Alaska, the geographical isolation of Montana, or the lack of major cities in North and South Dakota, each state has its own story to tell. But remember, it's not all about the numbers. These states offer unique experiences, breathtaking landscapes, and a glimpse into a different pace of life. They have their own charms that beckon the adventurous and the curious. If you enjoyed this journey through the lesser populated states, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Let's aim for 100 likes for this video. Until next time, happy exploring!